So many thanks for the welcome. There are many people in the room I recognize. Roland, you and your colleagues have been doing an extraordinary job of putting Ottawa U on the map of international relations writ large. And of course, the Development Studies program here also has been doing a great job, and I see Nipa up front here, and I know there are others involved as well. I'll say a few words about the International Development Research Center at the outset, because I might forget to later, and it could be of interest to some of the students here. We're a Crown corporation, a semi-autonomous body. We work to a board of governors. We receive from the Parliament of Canada an appropriation of, a regular appropriation of about $160 million a year, to which has been added perhaps 40 million more for some specific projects the government's entrusted to us. And we raise quite a bit of money of our own by partnering with others, the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the British Department for International Development, and others. So in all, we spend about $260 million. You'll understand that's very modest compared to the overall Canadian international assistance envelope, which is somewhere around $5 billion at the moment, although it's capped for the next few years. So we are very much the younger and greatly smaller cousin of CIDA. On the other hand, we have a very focused mandate. And that mandate is to support research in the developing world that can be useful to countries and regions in shaping improved policies of their own. So all of this research we fund has to be at least potentially policy relevant, and nearly all of it winds up being policy relevant. Whether governments and regions pick up on the research or not, we can never guarantee, but quite a lot of it has been absorbed into policy over the years. We're active in all regions of the developing world. Unlike CIDA, we don't have countries of concentration. We fund where we think the research is most promising and where the likelihood of policy uptake also is greater. We support a number of institutions in emerging countries as well, countries like Brazil, India, where development issues are still at the core of public debate, even though the countries statistically are emerging very quickly, but often trailing very large numbers of poor, or in the case of India, ultra-poor people. It's important to remember that for developing countries, the model isn't necessarily Denmark or Canada anymore, if it ever was. The model now is more successful developing countries. So in Latin America, Brazil attracts a lot of attention. Aspects of Chile attract a great deal of attention. And Mexico, of course, attracts attention also. And the emergence of China and India is quite exciting for developing countries elsewhere, many of which share the challenges that China and India once had, and in many cases still have. So while we tend to think of emerging countries as increasingly a separate category somehow between the industrialized world and what we think of as developing countries, for developing countries, they are seen by and large as successful developing countries, and all the more interesting for it, countries of the global south. We are, of course, an employer and we're an employer in Ottawa as well as abroad. We have 6 regional offices spread throughout the developing world. In Ottawa, we have a staff of about 320. But we also take on every year a number of so-called professional development awardees and research awardees. We take on about 25 of them. They can come from abroad and they can come from anywhere in Canada. And these are colleagues who get to spend half of their time on a project of their own, a research project of their own that they have designed and that colleagues of mine thought was worthwhile, and about half of their time hyper-operationally involved in the work of IDRC itself, finding out what it's like to be a funder of something or other, and in our case, research. They pay reasonably well. They come with a generous travel budget so that the awardees can travel to the field and carry out field research of their own. And the results are often very interesting. Professional development awards tend to apply to postdocs and students in the middle of their doctoral studies, and research awards are more for those either on the verge of securing an MA or having already done so. We also take quite a large contingent of summer students every year, and sometimes students who work with us throughout the year on this project or that. So don't hesitate to make yourselves known to us. Obviously, all of this is hyper-competitive, so it's not done on a first-come, first-served basis. And it pays to watch our website for positions that may be coming open, and also for application cycles. For example, the application period for the Professional Development Awards and Research Awards has just closed. So if you're thinking of applying for one, you'd be thinking about the year 2012, because they run from January to December, and the application period for that would close probably around the 10th of September 2000. You'd be thinking about 2013, and the application process would close around the 10th of September in 2012. And of course, there are other employment opportunities at IDRC also. I should underline, though, I mentioned that the international assistance envelope has been capped by the government in the first wave of its deficit reduction decisions about 18 months ago. And like every other federal agency, Crown Corporation, or department, we are subject to strategic and operational review. And we don't know what the results of that review will be. We won't know until the budget sometime during the winter. So we may be operating in more straitened circumstances, probably will be over the next few years. But I'm sure we will still have the programs I mentioned and many of the opportunities I mentioned operating. Development, and why am I interested in it? Well, it's woven in and out of my life. I was very fortunate that when I was 8 years old, my parents went to live in Iran, where David Lee also lived. And they were there quite a long time because as a family we loved Iran. We found it tremendously interesting. So we were there nearly 5 years. And although I was too young to really notice what was going on around me in a way university students or professors would, a number of phenomena were clear even to me. And one was that Iran was on a forced march towards a Western-style economy at the time, very much encouraged by international donors and governments. Iran was traditionally, and still is, of course, a very conservative society in many ways. But at the time, this effort to modernize Iran at warp speed was the poster child of the World Bank, the IMF, and many others. And there were only very small how can I say, protests that this might not be working. There were hints it might not be working. For example, a few months after we arrived in Iran, there were widespread riots in the country against some of the modernization methods. These had been fomented by religious clerics, one of whom was Ayatollah Khomeini, who would come back into Iranian history some years later. But by and large, particularly international observers, are very good at ignoring what is inconvenient for them. So this was put down as something that was somehow sui generis and that could be generally ignored as an aberration. There was a small group of Iranian and French sociologists and anthropologists who kept publishing plaintive articles in obscure journals nobody read, saying this isn't working. Society is under great stress. Rural areas in particular don't like any of this. It's moving much too fast, and it's moving without any sensitivity towards what the population of the country think, and different strands of the population of the country. And they would occasionally add, and it's likely to end badly. Well, they had the grim satisfaction of being proved right about 15 years later when the Iranian Revolution in all of its fury unfolded during 1978. So this makes one, of course, extremely cautious about trends in international development. Ideas that seem like brilliant ideas to pretty well everybody involved in development at any given time. And if one watches the history of ideas in development, and I'm about with a number of colleagues to embark on a project trying to map the history of ideas influencing development and where that might be taking us in the future, one realizes that it's an extraordinarily fad-driven and trend-driven field compared to many others, and it's exceptionally unscientific compared to some. And so this leads one to be quite cautious, and this early personal experience of mine in Iran has remained with me because I remain strongly attached to this country where I was so happy as a boy, and many of my friends still are my Iranian childhood friends, many of whom have suffered through a great deal and whose families have. My second, I'd say, formative experience with development, and it shows how much things have changed, was when CIDA actually had a great deal of programming money and a very, very small staff, and in particular, very little deployment abroad. On my first diplomatic assignment, which was to Egypt, the embassy was also responsible for Libya, which involved mainly the consular problems of the many Canadians doing service jobs in Libya at the time, nurses, oil industry workers, and so on. But also Sudan, where the major feature of Canada's involvement was a very large CIDA program. And believe it or not, CIDA had nobody on the ground permanently. And as it turned out, I, commuting from Cairo to Sudan, became the local representative of Canada for the CIDA program. A large program, a diverse program, 6 large projects of very different sorts, from forestry inventories to road building, to agricultural productivity, enhancing efforts, and all launched with the best of intentions and after many, I'm sure, praiseworthy feasibility studies. There isn't a trace of any of them anymore today in Sudan. I was back in Sudan last year, no trace whatsoever. So what happened? Well, probably what happened is that a decision was taken that Sudan was a very poor country, but also a very important country in Africa, that if we were going to program in Africa, we should be programming in Sudan. And I'm sure a number of experts were consulted on what could be usefully done in Sudan that Canada might be good at doing. And then doubtless a delegation or two sallied forth from Ottawa to engage with the authorities in Sudan and put these ideas to them. And the Sudanese, doubtless, were extremely polite and said, yes, by all means, these sound like splendid ideas. Do please come and spend $30 million a year in our country. But actually, to the local communities involved, these projects had nothing to do with their lives. They didn't correspond to the needs of the local communities, it seems to me, and thus it was very difficult for them to take root. They could have been great technical successes. They could have been carried out with extraordinary intensity without growing any local roots. And if you don't grow local roots, you're going to disappear very, very rapidly, not over many decades. And so that experience and trying to track what was happening in these projects long after I had left Sudan, another country I became extremely fond of, was educational for me. Now, a parenthesis. I don't want to leave you with the impression that development itself is illusory. If you need any sense that development actually has brought huge successes over the last, say, 5 decades, all you need do is look at health statistics throughout the developing world, longevity statistics throughout the developing world, literacy statistics, even though the type of literacy achieved wouldn't necessarily correspond to literacy in Canada. These are not illusory developments in the countries involved, although the statistics are often doctored at the margins. The progress is real, in fact. So development does occur, but does it occur in the way that we in Canada think it should or does? Not necessarily. And I think one shortcoming of the development community writ large, coming back to some of my early remarks, in the past was the idea that there was a development model, in particular the World Bank, which has many strengths, not least its capacity to take in very promising people from all over the world and instill in them a healthy respect for rigor in research and for a serious approach to economics, unfortunately has often fallen victim to groupthink. So groupthink produces a single set of ideas that are then applied more or less to societies around the world indistinguishably, with often very, very bad results, not just indifferent results. Respect for the specificity of societies, the differences amongst societies, is relatively recent within the development community and not yet deeply enough anchored in the development community. Of the developing countries I've lived in, indeed, of all of the countries I've lived in, what makes them interesting is the differences between them, and it's the differences that are often very sharp. the commonalities are often harder, actually, to establish and to chart. So there has been a problem in the development field with this quest for the holy grail of the development model, which is going to be successful. Coming to that, I wanted to contrast the performance of India and China and their approach to, in particular, agriculture, both being economies we think of as highly successful in terms of the growth rates they've been achieving for the last 20 years. Important, again, a parenthesis, to remember that China is 3 times more advanced than India economically, both in absolute terms and per capita. So again, comparing them is like comparing apples and oranges, but comparing their approach to policy is easier, actually. And so how did agricultural policy in China and India evolve after 1949 and the communist triumph in China, and after 1947 and independence in India? India, by the way, was kept afloat food-wise by donors through the 50s and 60s because it simply wasn't in a position to feed itself entirely after independence. The British really left India flat on its back, and it took many decades before Indian policymakers could be confident that famine was a thing of the past. Famine had been so frequent during the British Empire period that it was a specter hanging over India. But happily, donors, principally Western donors, but not exclusively, kept India afloat during those years. China neither sought nor received food aid from abroad. And in the early years of the communist regime, in fact, all of the years of Mao Zedong, China was subject to terrifying economic and social experiments dreamt up in Beijing, often having to do directly or indirectly with how to organize agriculture. And so the Great Leap Forward, which was largely about agriculture and how to reorganize it, left 30 million dead in all likelihood. So these top-down ideas of how agriculture might be dealt with in the case of China, as in the case, by the way, of the Soviet Union, proved absolutely catastrophic. But in China, soon after Mao Zedong died and an interim period was dealt with, a very different leader who had suffered through the worst of the convulsions of the communist regime because he had been at the heart of the communist regime, Deng Xiaoping, came to power. And Deng Xiaoping was nothing if not exceedingly lucid. And drawing some conclusions, perhaps, from all these failed experiments, he exhibited a hearty respect for what peasants themselves might be inclined to do. Indeed, he called together China's agricultural establishment, and he said, what we do now with agriculture is nothing. We will now observe the peasants for 2 or 3 years. We will make it possible for them to do what comes naturally to them. If we are very lucky, they will remember what their grandparents used to do in agriculture. And we will observe them in different corners of the country, and we will draw conclusions from our observations. So a highly experimental approach, extremely respectful of ground-level traditions, which of course varied enormously over China, which is a huge and diverse country. nearly as big as Canada, but much more fully cultivated than Canada is. And it was only after this period of experimentation was over and conclusions started to be drawn that a new Chinese agricultural policy emerged with many variations across the country and many different facets, and also a degree of privatization of the use of land for the benefit of the peasants themselves. India had a very different experience. As I say, it was kept afloat by food grants. The US was very generous. Canada was pretty generous too. But in the mid-60s, Indira Gandhi, who was the new and rather feisty Indian Prime Minister, started to have sharper and sharper policy disagreements with the American government, notably over Vietnam. And the idea of India being reliant on American food aid became allergic to her. So only backed into the idea of a change of policy by that extremity did she decide to inquire into what Indian scientists had been up to since, in fact, the British era in terms of experimenting with hybrid grains and consulting scientists on what it would take to make India irrevocably self-sufficient in agricultural production. The great international seed specialist Norman Borlaug, later a Nobel Prize winner, was consulted. The great Indian agricultural scientist M.S. Swaminathan, who is in Ottawa every now and then, still alive and kicking at 85, and a member of the Indian Parliament, was consulted. And together they came up with a relatively simple scheme to both vastly increase the use of water for irrigation and also to make available to farmers much larger quantities of fertilizer. And this did bring about a revolution in Indian agricultural productivity, a revolution that lasted perhaps 10 years, from about 1970 to about 1980, or perhaps 1985. And since then, agricultural productivity growth in India has barely been increasing at all. It hasn't been keeping pace with population growth, for example. So India is again in trouble because after the scientifically driven approaches under Indira Gandhi, the Indian government felt success had been achieved and moved on to other things. When we look also more widely, leaving agriculture aside, at India and China, in China we have a totalitarian model with Chinese characteristics, in that the Chinese government is much more attentive to local communities than it was under Mao Zedong. The trouble is local communities are doing their own thing, and Beijing very often doesn't know what's going on until it has a riot on its hands. So the Chinese system is demonstrating early signs of fragility, one might think. India, on the other hand, is the world's largest democracy, and a huge success as a democracy. It has very high rates of participation in elections, particularly amongst the poor, by the way, unlike the West. But Indian politics are venal, corrupt, and very much a contact sport. So the sort of orderliness that helps economic development in China, because there is no politics to speak of, democracy requiring politics, politics often gets in the way of development in India, not just through corruption, but also through other forms of patronage. Beyond that, what has China focused on? China has focused on manufacturing and exporting its manufactures. India has focused primarily on agriculture. About 70% of India's population is still rural, although it yields quite a small share of India's gross domestic product, but secondarily services. So if you compare China's economic development model with India's economic development model, they couldn't be much more different. So this idea that there is a magic solution, that there is a formula that countries should be encouraged to adopt is just criminally delusional and has been a feature, alas, of a great deal of international thinking about development. Another problem is that while I take economics very seriously myself and development economics very seriously myself, there have been too many economists and not enough of those from other disciplines involved in informing development trends internationally. Some of you may have noticed last fall that the president of the World Bank gave a speech, I think it was in late October or early November, decrying the staffing patterns of the World Bank, saying, we got the most basic thing wrong. We got staffing wrong. Too many economists, not enough sociologists, anthropologists, and others. There's a fundamental imbalance in our intellectual model. Quite right, Bob. So this is something that the World Bank naturally is having trouble internalizing because it is the ultimate destination for many who aspire to be development economists, but also change, institutional change, is slow in coming. The OECD, which is a more widely gauged research institution than the World Bank is, although a much smaller one and a much poorer one, doesn't quite suffer from that excessive concentration in one discipline, although of course its very large economics and statistics department does feature an overwhelming preponderance of economists. Now, a few mild provocations before we go into an exchange of views. Conflict, and many, I think, at Ottawa U, many in the room are very interested in conflict. A number of are scholars of conflict, and very accomplished ones too. When it comes to conflict and development, we don't really know, and there may be no clear answer, even in individual cases, whether conflict leads to development failures or development failures lead to conflict. We do know that they're intertwined in a number of ways, but actual causality we aren't yet very far advanced on. We tend to think that war, corruption, violence are catastrophic for development. And as a general proposition, that would be true. But we also need to realize that some societies adapt quite well to each of those. If you think of Sri Lanka, it went on growing economically at a brisk pace and being by far the richest country, significant country of South Asia, throughout a particularly murderous and nasty civil war. If we think of corruption, we might think of a country we all think of as doing very well nowadays, Indonesia. Indonesia absorbs very large quantities of corruption and nevertheless keeps growing. China has its own forms of corruption, as we all know. India has its forms of corruption. All of them are growing very well. So studying corruption, establishing what specifically might be harmful, what aspects of corruption are either undesirable legally and socially, but perhaps not too damaging to development, is something we might do. But simply hectoring societies which are actually coping with the reality of corruption reasonably well and telling them that this is the worst thing on earth simply creates dissonance, because their experience, their very long experience, is that corruption is part of life, that it continues to be part of life, and that what's new is actually rapid growth in a number of cases, apparently unimpeded by massive corruption. Would the growth be even bigger without corruption? Probably it would. But if we start out in our positions by simply hectoring the societies involved, I don't think we're going to get very far in influencing their practices. Finally, violence. I've never lived in a society as violence-prone as India. It's a paradox, because in terms of individual physical security, one can wander anywhere in India and feel, as an individual, perfectly safe. But communal violence breaks out, separatist violence, and not just in Kashmir. There are a very large number of insurgencies, active and less active, in India's northeast, and Maoist insurgency affecting at least a quarter of India's districts. All of these are manifestations of violence that are so deeply rooted, so much part of daily life in India, that Indians barely think about them. Give you an example. While I was living in India, at one point, one of the separatist movements in Assam decided it needed to attract some attention in the Delhi newspapers because its policy agenda wasn't getting much attention. So it mowed down about 90 people, expecting this to attract attention. It didn't make page 1. It made page 11 or something in the papers that matter in India. So they took out 60 more and mowed down 60 more, and that got them on the front page of the paper. So that's the sort of violence and the levels of violence that a country like India lives with quite routinely. So the idea that Canadian conceptions of violence are perfectly applicable to societies elsewhere is, again, probably unhelpful, much as we would all wish every society to live without any violence. We're at a very interesting moment, finally, in international discussions about development. Why? Because we're in a slow-moving, probably long-lasting economic crisis. It's a made-in-the-West crisis for the first time in a very long time. It started with the United States. Europe seems to be slightly more troubled than the United States just now, but it's fair to say that the West as a whole is experiencing great difficulty and has been since 2007 for reasons you all know much more about than I do. Less noticed in our troubled West is the fact that by and large the developing world has done a whole lot better. It's been able to duck some of the worst of this. Growth trends throughout Africa have been much more positive over the last decade than in earlier decades. And indeed, in spite of a lot of alarmism, understandable alarmism amongst commentators, the reality is that throughout nearly all of the crisis, growth rates in Africa have averaged somewhere between 5% and 6%, which would look pretty good to us, and indeed looks pretty good in Africa. The emerging countries, which had a bit of a dip in 2008, case of India moving from 9% growth to 7.8% growth, very difficult to complain about that. So we're seeing something we're not used to. The West in deep trouble, much of the developing world still in urgent need of more development, but in relative terms doing much better than ourselves. And we're seeing the emergence at the global tables of influence of genuinely significant countries: China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, and so on. And there's a middle tier of countries that are extremely interesting also: Turkey, Chile, and a number of others. Perhaps Indonesia, one could mention. And precisely because we're so preoccupied with our own problems, we aren't actually noticing in Canada this phenomenon of emergence, or even beginning to draw any conclusions from it in terms of what the international order is likely to look like 15 to 20 years from now. Happily, the Center on International Governance Innovation in Waterloo has been paying quite a lot of attention to this. Several at Ottawa University have been paying quite a lot of attention to this, including Roland. But overwhelmingly, Canadians struggle to connect with what's happening in the wider world. So this is a very interesting time to be thinking, not just about development, but about the range of development experiences, where this has led countries, what the significance of the development of a country like Brazil, a country like India might be, and what the variety of economic models, for example, in Africa, are likely to look like in, say, 15 to 20 years from now. So I'll stop there, et merci, c'est à moi de vous écouter.